This was the real passion project, before being set aside as too big for me, and something I lacked confidence in my ability to complete at a level of quality I find acceptable. The origins of this project was to fix problems I saw in The Sims, especially The Sims 4. The design changes went beyond what I think could be accomplished through modding, and would require their own game. Some of the goals included being better designed for rotational family play, having advanced procedural story progression for unplayed characters, facilitating unexpected sequences of events and emergent story generation, and adding a certain amount of realism to gameplay in the form of believable consequences to a character's actions, that is, to a player's choices. In addition, I hope to make the game more strategic. The original Sims was described on its box as a strategy game, something no one would call newer Sims games, and which I would want to bring back to my own take on the genre. When I first started putting ideas together, I had played two Sims games, the original game, also known as The Sims 1, and The Sims 4. With just the original game, everything made sense and seemed right. The lack of aging didn't seem like a problem, as there was no reason to assume Sims wouldn't live as many days as a real person. And I don't expect you to seem noticeably older in 100 or even 1,000 days, unless you are very young or very old. With only the original game, it was easier to assume that it was only the babies that were weird, which makes sense considering how difficult and disruptive they are, and that career and skill development was accelerated, again, for gameplay. Then, after being away from the series for a while, I tried The Sims 4. At first it was all fine. I was confused and disappointed by the lack of the open world I'd been told had been added in a previous series entry, but that wasn't too big a deal. I dragged my feet indecisively, so my starting couple had kids late in life and died before they were grown. But that was cool. It made a great emergent story. Then it happened. The second generation reached adulthood. Two Sims who each were planned to marry and start their own families, something I hadn't had to deal with in a Sims game before. What to do? The daughter, being older, married first, got the parents home, and the son moved out. And I was uncertain what to do with aging and time settings. Aging for played Sims was ultimately turned off, and the days rolled by with pre-made Sims dying of old age and being replaced by random Sims which also died of old age. This seemed wrong. The Goths had no grandkids? All Sims the game started with just grew old and died without doing anything or evolving in any way? I added more played families, supposedly descendants of my Sims 1 families, and experimented more with time and aging settings, slowly working out how to do a proper rotation, with aging off for unplayed Sims. But the impression that this was not the best way stayed. Fixing what I saw as a problem with aging and story progression was, from the beginning, the primary goal in designing my own life simulation game. That can't be stated strongly enough. How to best allow aging across the world while keeping the unplayed characters up with those who are being played. My first idea was to divide time for unplayed characters by the number of played households, causing them to age more slowly and for story progression to update more slowly by the same factor. Thus, if the player had 5 played households in a save file, all unplayed characters would age at 1/5 the normal rate, and run story progression at 1/5 speed. Played households and characters within them would age at normal speed, but only while being played. Of course, played households would have no simulated story progression since their stories are progressed through gameplay. For played characters, everything, including relationships, would be frozen while unplayed, except for relationships with the members of the active household. A related planned feature was a screen that would allow played households to be sorted based on either when last played or total time played, to make it easier to keep track of which households should be played next. New families would likely have the age of the least played family added at creation. Other ideas were later considered, such as having unplayed characters track the most or least played household, or the average age of played households, or perhaps allowing players to choose how to age them as a game setting. It's worth pointing out that you can partially do this in The Sims 4, though with some limits and a fair number of hoops for the player to jump through to pull it off. Basically, set up a strict rotation, pick one household for unplayed Sims to track, and turn aging and story progression on when you start playing that household, and off when moving to the next household. A lot of my ideas really just automate this approach in various ways while allowing the player to be a little less strict by keeping track of who might need some catch-up time. The other major feature I wanted from the beginning was an open world, so that different members of the active household could be active on different lots at the same time. I was tired of Sims abandoning important tasks because another member of the household went somewhere, or keeping all Sims sequestered to a lot to avoid that. Like, sorry kid, you can't meet your friends at the Bluffs because Mom needs to finish her book. That sucks. Thus, an open world was also a must-have. Part of my plan for an open world involved what I called plexi-lots. Lots that could be used as a rabbit hole, but also fully entered if you wanted to follow a character there. My other major disappointment in The Sims 4 has to do with control, or what I should and should not control. Regardless of the genre, I expect to control my characters, not the rest of the world. The world, including other characters, should respond to my character's action, but not directly respond to my controls. This applies to shooters, RPGs, RTS, and yes, to life simulators. When I tell a sim to talk to another sim, I expect my sim to walk over and initiate interaction. I do not expect or want the other sim to come to my sim and present themselves to be interacted with. I don't expect a bartender to walk off the job into the parking lot to be spoken to. But that's just exactly what The Sims 4 does. This didn't happen in older Sims games, and would not happen in any game I made. Of course, there is more to the design than just how time in the world should work. Another area that is of obvious importance is personality. There are pros and cons to both a small number of universal numeric traits, such as those found in the first two Sims games, and the use of discrete descriptors, such as those found in The Sims 3 and 4. The first approach is easy to mathematize, allowing for easy comparison and the creation of behavioral genetics, among other things. The newer system has the advantage of allowing finer details that can help make an individual seem more unique. My plan was to use both, with a list of core traits based on a model of personality called Hexaco for honesty, emotionality, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness, though with some intentional inconsistency in which emotionality is conflated with neuroticism from the 5-factor model of personality when it would work better for gameplay. Then a number of minor descriptive traits similar to those from recent Sims games or the canceled Life by You would be added. I was at one point concerned this would seem like just throwing in everything that had already been tried. However, I've seen the streamer T-Addict playing with a mod that adds Sims 3 traits to Sims 2, while the notable YouTuber Simmer Aaron has mentioned liking the idea of both traits in a game. In addition, I plan to include something like the ability scores from RPGs, but keyed more toward career areas, probably called talents in game. Intellectual, creative, practical, social, and physical. Of course, a selection of likes and interests would also be available. There was also a plan to apply a kind of behavioral genetics to the core personality traits and the talents, using what I call the 3-gene system. This system uses 2 real genes, which can be inherited, along with a randomly generated fake gene to represent complexities of genetics and prenatal development that go beyond being modeled in a game, as well as to keep things interesting by making subsequent generations less predictable. Of course, these genes are simply numbers. I also hope this system could be applied to physical traits, such as skin and hair tones, body type, facial proportions, and anything which could be set by sliders representing continuous values in character creation. Emotions were planned to primarily influence the autonomy AI, and perhaps unlock some interactions. For example, cruelty might normally be limited to mean or evil characters, but might also be unlocked by anger. Inspiration for the emotion system was taken from Plotnik's Wheel of Emotions, though with changes and liberties to make it fit the game design better. The modified wheel was then mapped onto a plane with a positive, negative, and approach a void dimension. Story progression was planned to be treated as a goal selection and action planning problem, not unlike that for ordinary autonomy. Essentially, all unplayed characters in the game would update life plans daily, at least potentially, based on personality, relationships, and general circumstances. It might then decide to pursue new relationships, make career choices, try for children with current partners, and so forth, with such plans designed to typically play out over the coming week, or perhaps 2 weeks for involved or long-term plans, though with the possibility of modifying plans. I would like to point out here that all this planning was intended to be done through traditional game AI, and there was no plan to try to create or to use real AI such as LLMs or generative AI. In other words, still be closer to Pac-Man than to ChatGPT. In many ways similar to a cross between The Sims with its utility AI and, to a lesser extent, an action planning approach simpler than but similar to the GOAP system of fear. So, what happened? Why was this abandoned? First of all, I've decided this is just too big for me. Too big for one person. Someone working alone with modern technology probably could create a clone of the core features of the Sims 1 base game as an unpolished, feature-incomplete prototype. This would be a long way from a modern Sims game or a viable Sims competitor, and a long way from what I was trying to make. There's a reason games like this are made by teams. Every bit is harder than it looks on the surface. For example, Build By turned out to be much more difficult than anticipated. It would be easy, even trivial, to let the player place game objects to create walls, but this isn't at all what you want. That would allow walls to be built on top of walls, have no concept of a room, and have many other problems. Instead, you need build actions to modify an underlying data structure from which the house is built, and rebuilt every time the underlying data is modified. You also need to detect room boundaries and tell which parts of a lot are in which room. Perhaps a flood fill algorithm? Maybe something else. And that is assuming only straight axis-aligned walls. Adding diagonal walls makes it more complicated. Allowing curved walls or arbitrary angles, much more complicated. Perhaps I could keep it simple. Stick to axis-aligned walls, or 45-degree angles at most, and hope lib mode gameplay carries it. But it's still far from simple to get good, polished build mode with the necessary features, and limiting build mode would definitely be held against it by those who are used to more complex building. Another matter that came to mind is it worth it? No game is perfect. Mine, even if I got everything I wanted working, wouldn't be either. And even if it was perfect to my taste, it would not be perfect to everyone's taste, or likely to anyone else's taste, even if well liked. Games are not perfect. Nothing is. Some things are annoying, but I can just not greet bartenders before ordering. I can play different Sims games, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. None of them perfect, none of them completely to my taste, but fun in their own ways. In the end, I'm really a casual player. I don't really want to spend years of my life trying to make a better version of The Sims. Is there any real chance I'd succeed anyway? Even if I were to try to make it purely as a product to sell, it's likely beyond my skill. The original Sims, though hard and surly game, is strangely good for casual play due to its simplicity and lack of time pressure. The Sims 2 has a solution to the time and aging problems I'd have never thought of, allowing your Sims to age up other Sims with them so they can grow up with their friends, while leaving other unplayed Sims as extras until needed. The Sims 3 doesn't really work for rotational play, but is great for generational family play and has the advantages of an open world. The Sims 4, despite its flaws, can be very cozy, and now has tons of content, even if getting that content is pricey. Not that I can even launch that one anymore, thanks to the EA app not working right with Proton. You could say I've chilled out, and would rather just enjoy playing a game instead of torturing myself trying to make something that should be made by a whole team of specialists, including people who are better programmers than I am. And so I set this aside and began working on a first-person RPG, a Scrolls-like, which it turns out is a much easier genre to make on a technical level. Perhaps more work designing and creating content, a hell of a lot more work, but very much easier in terms of mechanics and programming. But that is another story, perhaps another video.